Hello, my name is Anne Porter, and I'm the founder and CEO of Aussie Deaf Kids. Welcome to this webinar presented by Michelle Todorov on classroom engagement of children who are deaf or hard of hearing attending mainstream schools. Unfortunately, I forgot to press the record button at the beginning of Michelle's presentation. So the first few minutes are a voiceover from the caption transcript of her presentation. You'll recognise when the actual recording begins. So Dr. Michelle Todorov has 7 years of experience working as a clinical audiologist and researcher at the University of Melbourne. Her research focuses on the education of children who are deaf or hard of hearing. She has just completed her PhD, where she investigated the classroom engagement of students who are deaf or hard of hearing attending mainstream schools. This is such an important topic, so I'd like to hand over to Michelle without further ado. Thank you very much. I'm not technically a doctor yet because my PhD is still with the examiners, but I'm almost there. Before I start my presentation, I wanted to provide a little bit of context about how I became interested in this area of research. I'm an audiologist. I've been working at the University of Melbourne within the Department of Audiology and Speech Pathology for several years. I worked clinically and across various research studies, but in the clinic I spend a lot of time assessing hearing in soundproof booths where acoustics are perfect. Patients listen to clicks and clearly spoken words. But the children with hearing loss and their families I was seeing were telling me about difficulties they were experiencing in real-world settings, such as classrooms. They were talking about being tired by the end of the day and having to tune out because it was all too much. I became interested in these real-world difficulties that I was hearing about anecdotally through my work, and I decided I wanted to investigate them further with my own research in a PhD. In this presentation, I'll be discussing my PhD research. Now, I've got my 2 articles up on the screen that relate to the research that I'll talk about today. I can provide a link to them through Anne so that you can access them as well. In Australia, as well as many other countries over the past few decades, there's been more and more students with hearing loss being educated in mainstream classrooms. For children who are deaf or hard of hearing, this has resulted in a drift from schools for the deaf to mainstream schools with peers who have typical hearing levels. In the Australian context, and perhaps more specifically in Victoria, where this research was carried out, mainstream schools can have a deaf facility or hearing unit where a teacher of the deaf is based at the school and there is a critical mass of deaf and hard of hearing students. Or they can have a visiting teacher of the deaf service. There may be only 1 or 2 students with hearing loss at the school, and they're serviced through teachers of the deaf who visit the school. The shift to inclusion has brought many benefits for the education of children with hearing loss. So they've had greater access to the curriculum and increased social interaction with hearing peers. They've had improved academic performance. But in contrast, the shift to inclusion has brought challenges for students that are deaf or hard of hearing. When compared to peers with normal hearing, children who are deaf or hard of hearing can experience more listening difficulties in the classroom. That may have implications for their classroom engagement. So what exactly is classroom engagement, and why is it important? In the context that I'm using it in, engagement refers to the students' involvement in the classroom and their interest and enthusiasm directed towards their learning. Classroom engagement is important because we know that in general, students who are more engaged learn more. They have better outcomes than students that are disengaged. That's not just students with hearing loss, that's all students. Students aren't always engaged in their learning. An Australian study has tracked 1,300 students and found that 40% of them displayed regular unproductive behaviours. Engagement is complex and affected by many factors. Engagement is worsened by being disinterested in the curriculum, being bored or fatigued, and also difficulties in attention, memory, poor self-confidence, and so on. Children with hearing loss are likely to experience additional difficulties to this that might affect their engagement. Children with hearing loss may have more trouble engaging in the classroom due to factors such as increased difficulty understanding what's being said. So having a hearing loss makes it more difficult to hear what's being said by the teacher and by classmates, particularly in noisy and reverberant environments. Children who are deaf or hard of hearing may experience increased listening effort and resulting fatigue. In addition, teachers need to be equipped with specialised knowledge and skills to help facilitate the inclusion of deaf and hard of hearing students. All of these factors are likely to make engagement more challenging for deaf and hard of hearing students.
And beyond, there's very limited research focusing on classroom engagement of deaf and hard of hearing students, which is what has led me to complete this research. As part of my PhD research, the first part of the studies focused on measuring the engagement of deaf and hard of hearing students using observations of them in their classrooms, as well as questionnaires. But instead of focusing on that in today's talk, I'll focus on the second part of my research studies, which involve deaf and hard of hearing children, as it provides more practical insights. So the aim of this study was to explore the barriers and facilitators to engaging in mainstream classrooms for students who are deaf and hard of hearing. And to address the aim, I interviewed deaf and hard of hearing students because I felt, well, who better to ask than the students themselves? So there were 16 deaf or hard of hearing students that participated in the interviews. They were enrolled in grade 3 to 6 at mainstream primary schools in Victoria. They were from 11 different classrooms across 6 different schools, and all but one of the participants attended a mainstream school with a deaf facility. So this is a group of deaf and hard of hearing students that had a lot of support and had sort of a critical mass of deaf and hard of hearing students at their school. They had hearing loss in both ears of moderate degree or greater, so it was quite significant hearing loss, and they were aided with hearing aids or cochlear implants. The deaf and hard of hearing students in this research all communicated predominantly using spoken language, and they didn't have any comorbidities. So in terms of the method, the interviews consisted of 2 components. The first component was discussion generated from a list of interview questions, such as the questions on the image on the left. The second component was a card sorting activity, which is the image on the right. The card sorting activity was included to generate additional conversation, given that children may be reluctant to participate or lose focus after a series of verbal questions. In the card sorting activity, a list of potential barriers and facilitators were written on cards, and each participant was provided with a chart to sort the cards into 2 columns. So yeah, we used a combination of the interview questions and the card sorting activity to generate as much discussion with the participants as we could. We audio recorded the interviews, and then they were transcribed, analysed, and they were analysed using a method called thematic analysis, which is a qualitative method. From the analysis of the interview transcripts, lots of different barriers and facilitators were identified. These were grouped into 4 overarching themes. The barriers to engagement were considered as a single theme, and the facilitators to engagement were split into 3 themes: student strategies, supports to students, and teacher actions. I'll go through each individual barrier or facilitator now and provide accompanying quotes in speech bubbles that are directly from the deaf or hard of hearing students. The first overarching theme is challenges to engagement. So this includes things that the deaf or hard of hearing students reported make it harder for them to engage in their classroom learning. The first challenge to engagement, and the one which was most commonly reported by the students, was the presence of background noise. Every student spoke about noise making it difficult for them to understand what the teacher was saying. Now, the quotes are in speech bubbles, and I'll either read through them or make sure I allow you enough time to read through them yourself. So most of the participants talked about being impacted by noise that was generated from inside the classroom. So for example, this student said, "It's better when the classroom's quiet because you can hear everyone rather than when it's all noisy and you don't know who to listen to." Some participants also talked about experiencing noise that was generated from outside the classroom. So this second quote is from a grade 6 student, and there must have been an extra grade 6 class that year. So they were based in the prep building. And she said, "Because we're in the prep building, we have a lot of preps that are really noisy and they scream and that. And we're at the front near the door, so we can hear people exiting and coming in and then out. And then we can just hear people outside. So there's the noise that's sort of coming from inside, but also outside the classroom that can affect them." Now, just as an aside, although it wasn't a direct aim of my research, I measured the acoustics of the participants' classrooms. In Australia, there are recommendations for classroom acoustics in terms of noise levels and reverberation. In other countries, such as the US, these standards are enforced, but in Australia, they're not enforced. And when things aren't enforced, that often means that they're not met. In my research, I found that 4 of the 11 classrooms, or 1/3 of the classrooms, they didn't actually meet Australian standards. Most of the time, this was because of high levels of reverberation. For example, in one school, there were these old Victorian type classrooms with really high ceilings and windows all along the walls, which looked beautiful, but they had really high reverberation and they didn't meet the standards. This means that the sound just bounces around the room, and it's almost like being in a big hall or a sports stadium. So it doesn't surprise me that so many of the deaf and hard of hearing students highlighted the impact that noise was having on their ability to engage in their learning. And that school also had portable classrooms, which actually had much better acoustics. So after visiting that school and sort of finding that out, in the following year, they were able to sort of put the students that were in class, deaf and hard of hearing students, they were able to put their classes in the rooms with better acoustics, but it wasn't something they had sort of previously noticed. The next barrier is difficulty during small group work. Many participants reported that they have difficulty hearing when doing small group work. Now, this is because background noise gets generated quite quickly when there's lots of different groups talking about different things. And the discussion's dynamic with frequent changes in the target speaker, making it difficult to follow their conversation. Some of the participants talked about taking initiative to either move to a quieter room or to use technology so they could hear their peers in a group situation. So this participant's saying, "I had 4 people in my group and I did ask for the FM because it was really noisy because 2 classes were combined in together." So they sort of had to take the initiative, I guess, to ask for the FM system to help in that scenario. Some, but not all participants reported experiencing physical effects such as headaches as a consequence of high levels of classroom noise. Participants linked these physical effects to difficulty concentrating, which would result in increased feelings of stress and difficulty engaging in the classroom. I'll just give you a few seconds to read that one. Another barrier was difficulty with assistive listening devices. A range of different assistive listening devices were used in the participants' classrooms. So firstly, FM systems, which as you may know, consist of a microphone worn around the teacher's neck and a receiver connected to the student's hearing aid or cochlear implant, allowing the signal to be delivered directly to the student. The signal can also be delivered through a sound field system to one or more loudspeakers in the room. And that manner of amplification of the teacher's voice provides a consistent signal regardless of how far the student is from the teacher. The other assistive listening device that was used by participants in this study were handheld or roving microphones. So they're used by the deaf or hard of hearing students' peers when they're talking or answering questions. And with the handheld microphone, the signal is also sent directly to the student's hearing aid or cochlear implant or through the sound field system. Now, participants described difficulty engaging in the classroom when the devices were not functioning, not used, or when their signal was not clear. They did also talk about a lot of benefit from them, but there were times when they were a barrier. So this student said, if both of the FMs are flat, I can't even hear. I need to charge it for like the whole day. Participants also spoke about difficulties hearing when the handheld microphones were not used. So sometimes they don't hand the microphone out to the children so the deaf kids can hear. Sometimes they forget. I don't know what they're saying and it's hard to hear what they're saying. Difficulties also arose when the signal through the FM system or through the handheld microphone was not clear. So the first quote there is, when it's like in your jumper and it makes all of those rustling sound, which is like the FM rubbing against clothes, it means that it blurs the voice away so you can't hear it. And that second quote, people like to play with it, the microphone vent on the handheld microphones. It makes fiddly noises and I can't hear anything. Another barrier to engaging was when the children were given multi-part instructions. So this student said, it's hard to get included in the class and like you're not sure what we're working on because she's the teacher giving you so many instructions all at once. One participant suggested that it would be easier if either the instructions were written down or provided one at a time. The final barrier to engagement was around confidence. Some students lacked confidence to ask for help when they could not understand what was being said in class. Again, I'll just give you a few seconds to read through that quote. Okay, so we'll move on to the facilitators to engagement. And first of all, the student strategies. So student strategies are things that deaf or hard of hearing students can do to help them engage in the classroom activities. The first one is sitting at the front. So many participants said that sitting at the front rather than towards the back helped them to understand what the teacher was saying, particularly if the FM system was not being used or if the teacher was softly spoken. The next student strategy is asking the teacher for support or adjustments. Some of the students talked about asking their teacher for support or adjustments to help manage their challenges to engagement. So this involves the students taking initiative to advocate for their needs. One student advocated for the use of captions when watching videos. So she said, if the captions are used, I have that really good idea of what's going on. If the captions aren't used, I can't understand. I mentioned it to my teacher a couple of months ago because I just realised, and yeah, it's made a huge difference. Other participants talked about moving seats in particular situations so that they could hear more easily. For example, this student talked about moving to a quieter space when she was doing group work. And I'll just let you read through that one. The final student strategy is ensuring access to facial cues. For students who are deaf or hard of hearing, sitting in a position where they can see the face of the teacher and or their classmates can be helpful for them to engage. Some students talked about the benefit of seeing people's face to understand what's being said in class. And I guess some students might be more reliant on lip reading than others. And there's obviously additional challenges that come now with COVID and face masks, because this research was done prior to COVID. All right, next we will talk about supports to students, which are people or things that the deaf and hard of hearing students make use of to help them engage. So as I mentioned before, with assistive listening devices. So many participants spoke about the importance of the FM system. They reported that when their teacher was using the FM system, it helped them engage because they could hear the teacher explaining the content or asking questions or giving instructions. A smaller proportion of the participants in this study reported that handheld microphones were regularly used by their classmates. So all the participants had regular use of the FM system, but only some of them had regular use of the roving microphones. The ones that did use them said that the use of the handheld microphones was helpful because they could hear what their classmates were saying when talking or answering questions. And the final assistive listening device being sound field systems. So participants reported that the sound field system could help them to hear what was being said in class, particularly if they were not wearing their hearing aid that day. There was one participant who had lots of middle ear problems and ear infections, and there were days where she couldn't wear her hearing aids because of that. And in those circumstances, she found the sound field system was quite helpful. The next support is support from the teacher of the deaf. The students sort of overwhelmingly talked about their teachers of the deaf as being a major support to help them engage in their classroom learning. They talked about receiving in-class support where their teacher of the deaf spent time with them in the classroom to provide them with assistance. But they also talked about receiving out-of-class support, so withdrawal sessions where the student could work with a teacher of the deaf one-on-one or in a small group environment. The next support is support from classmates. The participants also consistently noted the valuable role that their classmates played in supporting them and helping them to engage. This could be through direct support, such as having friends in their class who they felt comfortable to go to ask for help. Or it could also be through just more generally having classmates who create an inclusive environment. The final support is sign language support. I mentioned before, the participants in this study, they use spoken language as their primary mode of communication. So all of their teacher instruction was spoken language. However, some participants did have some knowledge of Auslan, and a student who attended a school that taught Auslan as a specialist subject, like as a LOTE, had talked about the benefit of using Auslan to help her engage when she had missed what was said. I'll just give you a few seconds to read that one. Lastly, we will talk about teacher actions, which refers to the classroom teacher as opposed to the teacher of the deaf. And these are things that are within the control of the classroom teacher that the students had reported help them to engage in their learning. So firstly is providing written information. And providing written information was discussed in two themes, written instructions and captions. In terms of written instructions, the participants expressed the importance of having visual information to supplement what was being said in class. So this student said, say if the teacher writes it on the board, then I can like get it in my head. So I don't have to, so it's not about using a big or a small voice, and I can just see it without anyone talking. In terms of captions, participants talked about the helpfulness of having captions on the screen when watching videos in class. So the first quote there, "Well, it, having captions, makes me want to join in more because I can understand what the person is saying." I found this second quote quite interesting about you can't lip read with those cartoon characters whose mouths just go up and down. She said, so sometimes like cartoons or something like that, their lips just go up and down. So sometimes you don't know what they're saying. So it's easier to know what they're saying. So she really relies on captions in those circumstances. The next teacher action is ensuring that students can see the teacher's face. Some of the participants discussed that being able to see the teacher's face was an important factor for them understanding what the teacher was saying. However, it wasn't always possible if the teacher was writing on the whiteboard and talking at the same time. The next teacher action was relating to the teacher's voice. So students mentioned that it was important that their teachers spoke clearly and not too fast so that they could understand what was being said. Again, I'll just give you a few seconds to read through those quotes. Good classroom management facilitated the students' engagement as well. So participants reported that it was much easier for them when the teacher made sure it was quiet before they started talking. Easier said than done, I'm sure. They also talked about the need for teachers to repeat what was said by other students, particularly when a handheld microphone wasn't used. So in this scenario, the student said, sometimes we forget to use the microphone, or maybe the common area, we don't use the microphone because there's way too many people. So that was sort of an assembly type situation. So my teachers, like if they ask a question, they repeat it, and it's actually good because the teacher is wearing the transmitter and then I'll know what they're talking about. And finally, the last teacher action is being mindful of a better hearing ear. So most participants in this research had hearing loss that was quite equal in both ears, but one student had quite asymmetrical hearing loss, with one ear being much better than the other. And he expressed the importance of his teacher standing on his left side when talking to him, as that was the side of his better ear. So he said, be mindful and maybe go to the left side if they only have one ear, or go to the left side because they can hear a lot better. So in conclusion, this study identifies a range of factors that help or hinder deaf and hard of hearing students from engaging in mainstream school. And when these are identified, this information should be used to inform teachers, students, parents, health professionals to work towards reducing the barriers and increasing the facilitators to engagement to help deaf or hard of hearing students achieve their potential at school and beyond. And a lot of this information probably sounds familiar and things that we've heard before, but the fact that it's sort of still coming up just sort of reiterates how important it is for the students and how important it is to try to make sure we are doing those things. That concludes my talk, but before I go to any questions that there might be, I'd like to express my gratitude towards the participating schools for supporting this research, and of course to the participating children. It was a real privilege to have the chance to interview these children, some of which were as young as 9 years old. And I was really blown away because despite them being so young and thinking that when I interviewed them, they would just give me a brick wall, they were really open and articulate in expressing the things that were important to them in the classroom. And from those discussions, I felt a real sense of responsibility to share what they had talked about, as it may help other children in the future. So thank you all for joining this presentation so that I could share that. Thanks also to my PhD supervisors, Associate Professor Karen Galvin and Professor Field Rickards, as well as collaborators Sharon Cleve and Renee Punch. And finally, thank you to the Westpac Bicentennial Foundation for funding this research.